We are already working to improve the way pre-sentence reports are prepared in order to eliminate bias. There is important work that's been done to identify ethnicities within the system. In essence, the vital tools, the vital foundations here being laid in order to deal with the challenge that she rightly poses.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following the immensely disruptive Extinction Rebellion protest last year and the violence and the criminal damage we saw committed over the weekend by a small minority of thugs, is my right honourable friend confident that the law as it stands is on the side of the law-abiding majority and our brave police officers who have really stood up and been counted over the past couple of months?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right to praise the work of our brave police officers and indeed all emergency workers who put themselves on the line, particularly in the context of this crisis. And we are indeed in the process of looking very carefully at the sentencing maximums for assaults on emergency workers, and I will update the House with the progress that we will make on that.
The privatisation of probation has been a complete failure. The Secretary of State might want to remind his colleagues of Serco's role in that failure, given the way they've just been awarded the contract for COVID test and trace. But for today, will the Secretary of State tell us when the family of probation services will be brought back together in their rightful place in the public sector and end the scandal of privatisation?
Well, the honourable gentleman knows that last year an important announcement was made as to the reform of the probation service, which is progressing. There will be, I'm considering the matter very carefully in light particularly of COVID-19 and the effects upon the process, and I will make a statement to the House as soon as possible.
Pragmatic.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The land banking scandal of nearly a decade ago is as real today as it was then to some people, especially in cases where solicitors have been prosecuted and struck off by the SRA. The SRA deem compensation claims out of time after a year, even when the timescale from prosecution to striking off can be over a year. Will my right honourable friend ask the Legal Services Board to investigate whether the discretionary compensation fund administered by the SRA is actually fit for purpose?
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and he and I have discussed this matter on a number of occasions, and he is right to raise this sensitive issue for those who have been unjustly deprived as a result of a fraud. The fund that he knows which is operated by the SRA is for those who have suffered financial loss specifically caused by solicitors. They consulted earlier this year, between January and April. They would need to seek the approval of the LSB for any changes to the fund. I think we need to be realistic about the fact that any compensation fund will not be able to fully recompense those who lost under it, but I take the point that he makes about time limits, and it is something that I will discuss with him further.
Topical 9 has been withdrawn. We go to Robert Logan. Robert Logan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following the death of George Floyd, there's been peaceful, socially distanced protests in both Buxton and Glossop in my constituency. We shouldn't pretend that there are not very clear differences between this country and the United States. It's 21 years since the Macpherson report, and as a country we have come a very long way since then, but there is still work to be done. What steps are the government taking to increase trust in the criminal justice system amongst BAME communities?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, and I can enlarge upon the points I was making to the Honourable Lady, the member for Newcastle Central. In February of this year, we published an update against each of the recommendations made by the Right Honourable Gentleman, member for Tottenham, and I've mentioned deferred prosecution schemes. There is also a change to the way in which the use of force in prison is scrutinised. We have completely revised the complaints process to ensure that they are fairer, and with regard to recruitment of BAME people into the system, we are now on target to meet our objective with regard to the number of the percentage of prison service recruits and have increased the number of senior leaders. And as the review recommended, we have concentrated on improving the quality and transparency of data, which ensures that we properly monitor ethnicity. A lot of work being done, a lot still to do.
We go to a virtual question from Joe Williams. Joe Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is reported today that ministers are desperately looking for venues for Nightingale courts. Well, 22 magistrates' courts were closed in Wales between 2010 and 2020. Will the minister reopen these courts so that the people of Wales can be properly served?
Well, the Honourable Gentleman makes an important point, but what he has to remember, of course, is that the extra courts need to be compatible with social distancing. So what we are looking for is space and room in order for people to stay safe. And that's why in Wales we've been looking particularly at civic buildings near to the established court centres in Cardiff and Swansea, and indeed I think of Mould as well, and the Carnarvon Crown Court, which I know well. I am confident from my close consultation with partners in Wales that the work is being done that will allow that capacity to increase and allow justice to be served more swiftly in Wales.
Tim Lawton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's now more than a year since my Civil Partnerships, Marriages and Deaths Act passed, and before it passed, my right honourable friends, colleagues did a lot of work on Section 4, which would amend the Coroner and Justices Act of 2009 to empower coroners to investigate stillbirths. That's still not happened. When is it going to happen?
Secretary Gavin.
Well, I'm extremely grateful to my honourable friend for his work on this matter, and I am, of course, happy to continue to meet with him on this. I'd hoped to publish our report on the consultation about now. COVID, I'm afraid, has affected things. My aim is to publish later this summer in accordance with his wishes, but I, of course, will engage with him on the matter.
We now come to the final question from north of the border, which is virtual from Carol Monaghan. Carol Monaghan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A recent study by the London School of Economics has shown that people are torn about using the contact tracing app due to civil liberties concerns. To increase public confidence, will he commit to bringing forward a legislative framework and independent oversight of the app to protect human rights?
Secretary Butler.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for that question. She knows that, of course, the Isle of Wight pilot is still ongoing, and the precise nature of the app to be used has yet to be determined. I think I'm quite clear, and I have been clear to the Joint Committee on Human Rights, that if there was to be any change in the basis of the use of data, then of course legislation would be necessary. But the important points for me are consent, which of the subject, and indeed the use of that data and confidentiality. And if the existing parameters are maintained, then legislation might not be necessary, but we'll have to wait to see the precise ambit of the app itself.
In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next, I am now suspending the House for 3 minutes Order. We now come to ask the Minister for the Cabinet Office if she'll make a statement on the fourth round of negotiations on UK's future relationship. I now call Rachel Reeves to ask her question. Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Minister for the Cabinet Office if he will make a statement on the fourth round of the negotiations on the UK's future relationship with the European Union.
Call Minister Penny Moulton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Negotiators from the UK and the EU held full and constructive discussions last week via video conference, led by David Frost, the UK's chief negotiator. The talks covered trade in goods and services, fisheries, law enforcement, criminal justice and other issues in which both sides engaged constructively. There was, however, no movement on the most difficult areas where differences of principle are at their most acute, notably fisheries, governance arrangements and the so-called level playing field. We have now reached an important moment for these talks. To make progress, we need to accelerate and intensify our work, and the Government is working closely with the EU to achieve that. It is our priority to conclude this negotiation in good time to enable our citizens and businesses to have certainty about the trading terms that will follow at the end of this year and, if necessary, to allow any ratification of agreements reached. We have always been clear that such a deal must of course accommodate the reality of the UK's well-established position on the so-called level playing field, on fisheries and the other difficult issues, and fully recognise the UK as a sovereign equal. The House should also be aware that this Friday, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster and I will be at the second meeting of the Withdrawal Agreement Joint Committee. We will be able to update the committee about the positive progress the UK is making on implementing our obligations, not least on citizens' rights and the Northern Ireland Protocol. But we will also emphasise that we will not be extending the transition period and will push the EU on implementing their obligations under the terms of the agreement. Mr. Speaker, this Government remains committed to our negotiations with the EU and the implementation of the withdrawal agreement, and will continue to keep the House updated on developments.
Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK left the European Union in January, and our task now is to build the best possible new relationship with our European neighbours. Our chief negotiator, David Frost, said last week that we need to conclude this negotiation in good time to enable people and businesses to have certainty about the trading terms that will follow the end of the transition period at the end of this year. We agree. But currently we are in the dark about what this new relationship looks like. Both the CBI and TUC are warning about the impact of chaos and uncertainty on jobs and on livelihoods. The Association of British Pharmaceutical Industries has warned this week that as a consequence of COVID-19, the stockpile of medicines has been run down and can't be rebuilt in terms of volume or range by the end of this year. And the Road Haulage Association says we are still missing the essential practical information on all new processes and procedures as the government look to introduce millions of extra declarations at the border each year. So does the Minister believe that 50,000 new customs officers processing these declarations adds to or reduces the red tape for UK businesses? From freight to farming, to fisheries to pharmaceuticals, we need clarity. During the general election, the Prime Minister claimed time and again that the government had an oven-ready deal. Its fundamental ingredients matter, Mr. Speaker, so will the Minister confirm, as they did back in December, that the government still guarantees no tariffs, fees, charges or quantitative restrictions across all sectors? Leaving on WTO standards or even a Canada-style deal does not guarantee this. That the government will safeguard workers' rights, consumer and environmental protections. There is much concern that this is no longer government policy. Does the government still commit to a broad, comprehensive and balanced security partnership, essential for bringing criminals to justice? And will the government respect the Good Friday Agreement in its entirety? To conclude, Mr. Speaker, this was not just a deal between the UK government and the European Union, but through the course of the election, it was the basis of a deal with the British people. We urge both sides to redouble efforts over the next few days and weeks to ensure progress is made by the end of this month, so the government can honour its commitment to ensuring a good deal for Britain by the end of this year.
Mr. Morton.
Well, I thank the Right Honourable Lady for those questions. She makes, at the start of her intervention, a powerful argument for not extending the transition period. If we've learned anything over the last few years, is that all that would do would be to extend the negotiations. And I agree with her that business and our citizens across the EU and actually around the rest of the world, who we also are focused on trade negotiations with, they want to have certainty about the future. And so we must press on with that. And that is one of the many reasons why we will not extend the transition period. She is also right to draw attention to the fact that we have obviously the COVID crisis going on. I know that she is aware of the huge amount of work that was done last year on no deal preparations, but also the tremendous work that civil contingencies and all government departments have been doing to ensure that supply chains remain strong, that we can quickly adapt, that we do have stocks of all sorts of goods, including medicines, that we need. Those are challenging times in light of what the world is facing at the moment. But that is our focus, and I can assure her of the incredible work that those civil servants are doing to ensure that our citizens have what they need when they need it. I take a keen interest in these areas as a former employee of the Freight Transport Association, and I can tell her that very shortly we will be saying more about our border operations. There is a tremendous amount of work gone on to improve on the communications that we had with businesses from every part of the UK last year to ensure that is really good, and not just that we're giving people the right information, but also that we're picking up solutions from the sector, because that is going to be key in getting this right. And on her remarks on rights, on animal welfare, on security, on zero tariff and zero quotas, our policy has not changed. And we will, of course, respect the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, and we expect the EU to do the same.
William Wright. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Regrettably, is not the insurmountable blockage in this entire process the refusal of the EU to accept the UK as a sovereign nation and therefore refuse to countenance a large-scale copy and paste of existing arrangements with the likes of Canada, South Korea and Japan to reach a mutually beneficial trading partnership?
Well, I think my honourable friend raises a good point. The areas where we still need to make progress will be helped when the EU remembers that we are a sovereign equal.
On behalf of the Mr. Speaker, and surprise, surprise, no Michael McCavity. When the going gets tough, the tough get gone, it looks like in this case. And it now looks like he's actually going to secure the no-deal Brexit he's always coveted. It's going to be misery heaped on misery as COVID and Brexit appear like the twin horsemen of the economic apocalypse, trampling over any prospect of a recovery. And whose fault is it going to be? Not obviously them, nothing to do with us, government. It's all these nasty, invidious Europeans. How dare they hold this government to the commitments they've already given in good faith? These fiendish Europeans asking us to deliver on what we've already agreed to. And when you see them sitting down to negotiate, Mr. Speaker, it's like watching the Scotland B team taking on Brazil of the 1970s. It's almost cruel to observe them with their screeds of documents and facts, and Team GB with their ill-fitting clown shoes. Mr. Speaker, we're having nothing more to do with this. Scotland is wanting out of all this. There was another opinion poll at the weekend. It showed majority for Scottish independence once again. The union that we covet isn't their failed variety. It's the European Union one. Does she now concede it's now no deal and it's no way that Scotland is going to be part of this impending disaster?
Well, I'm, of course, sorry that the honourable gentleman is disappointed to see me today. I'm always delighted to see him, and he will know that the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster needs no encouragement to come to the dispatch box. He has come to update the House. He has appeared in front of select committees, and he is committed to do so. I am here because he is unable to today. I'm not sure there was a question in the honourable gentleman's statement, but I can reassure him of my commitment to working with the Scottish Government to ensure that we have the best possible outcome from these sets of negotiations. I have been changing the format of how that is done. We have been putting in more time in key areas such as fisheries to ensure that the Scottish Government has everything it needs in order to contribute and ensure that we can work together constructively to get what our businesses and citizens need.
We're now heading over virtually to Lawrence Robertson in Tewkesbury. Lawrence Robertson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that the German Constitutional Court recently basically said that Germany doesn't have to follow rulings of the European Court of Justice if that's against German interests, even though they are members of the European Union, wouldn't it be unreasonable to expect the United Kingdom to obey any rulings from the European Court of Justice, given that we are not members of the European Union anymore?
Minister. Well, the Honourable Gentleman makes a very good point. The German Constitutional Court decision does again emphasise the point that we are a sovereign equal, and the EU needs to accept that, and its decision will obviously have implications for the EU to consider.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Article 131 of the Political Declaration says that if a dispute raises a question of interpretation of union law, the arbitration panel should refer the question to the Court of Justice for, and I quote, a binding ruling as regards the interpretation of union law. Given what the Minister just said, does the Government still stand by this commitment that the Prime Minister signed up to in October?
Minister. Well, the political declaration is not a treaty. There will be differences on both sides as to its interpretation. And the point that we have emphasised in the last few days is that the EU cannot be the referee in that.
Slane Saxby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have received a large number of emails from farmers and constituents in North Devon concerned about food standards once we leave the EU. So could my right honourable friend assure me and worried constituents that we will retain our current food standards and prevent the import of chlorinated chicken and other inferior food?
Well, I would refer the Honourable Lady to the very good letter, joint letter, that was recently sent out by the DEFRA and Trade Secretaries. And I think that in this, we should be trusting the consumer. If people don't want to put their faith in government, we should trust the consumer. And I think consumers want high-quality, fairly priced food with high animal welfare standards.
Claire Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's clear from the remarks that this deal is far from oven-ready. Is the Government prepared to say no to any deal which will diminish our food standards and our environmental standards and undermine British farming?
Yeah.
Well, of course, we are working towards a deal on those issues and on many other issues. On some issues, we very much feel that our interests are better served having separate agreements. The key point is that we cannot keep negotiating forever. We have to allow our businesses, our farmers, our citizens time to implement the decisions taken. And that is why we are at this key stage now where we have to increase and escalate negotiations, because we need to arrive at a deal soon.
Robert Courts. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The EU is insisting upon level playing field guarantees, the extent of which are not seen in any similar agreements and to which no sovereign country could agree. Would the Minister agree with me that if we are to reach that mutually agreeable and profitable deal, the EU is going to have to stop cherry-picking?
Well, I thank the Honourable Gentleman for that well-put point. Of course, the EU's proposals would bind us into EU law. They would impose controls over our domestic legal regimes, and that cannot be acceptable. It's not in the political declaration, and it's certainly not in any free trade agreement that I know of.
Heading north of the border to Angus Brendan McNeill. Angus.
Thankfully, Mr. Speaker, and I thank you for enabling this. Now, Mr. Speaker, during this COVID crisis, people are getting a taste of border restrictions and they don't like it. Leaving the customs union in the single market will give businesses more significant Brexit borders. Anybody worth their salt in business and trade negotiations knows the numbers. Now, given there is no good Brexit for the economy, and the damage to the economy was reckoned by the UK government at one stage to be between 6 and 8% of GDP, can I ask the Minister if she's got updated figures for the damage, deal or no deal, to the UK economy, jobs and business, or is it still 6 to 8% damage that we're looking at?
So it's this government's policy that over the medium to long term, we believe that our approach to Brexit will maximise the economic benefits to the United Kingdom. That is what we need to be focused on now, not just in our negotiations with the EU, but also in work that we're doing on rest of world trade. There are massive benefits to every part of the United Kingdom from that, and that is what we should all be working together to achieve.
Scott Benton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The speculation regarding a possible extension of a transition period is concerning the residents of Blackpool, nearly 70% of whom voted to leave the European Union. Does my right honourable friend agree that extending the transition period at this point would merely prolong the negotiations, prolong the uncertainty for businesses and delay the moment at which we can finally gain back control of our borders, and that none of these things are in the best long-term interests of the United Kingdom?
Minister.
Well, the Honourable Gentleman's constituents are very wise indeed. It would just prolong the negotiations, but also it would see us paying into the budget and being subject to laws that we had no say in designing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister spoke a moment ago about accommodating reality, but can I urge you to accommodate reality on the supply of crucial medicines and supplies to our NHS, rather than false hopes and aspirations, because that hasn't served us very well in the current crisis. The pharmaceutical industry said in an internal memo which was provided to the government in May that after the pandemic ends there will be, and I quote, less or zero product available in the market to allow for stockpiling of a broad range of products. So who is right, the pharmaceutical industry or the Minister?
Well, he's right that there are challenges, but those challenges are known, and a huge amount of work is going on to ensure that we can address them. And we will be saying more in the coming weeks about those issues and on our border operations.
Nicola Richards.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've heard that Germany think they can pick and choose which laws they comply with, yet Mr. Barnier still expects us to be subordinate to the EU laws. The Minister said that there'll be implications for the EU. Does she agree with me that this not only undermines the negotiations, but the EU project as a whole?
Well, the judgment of that court clearly raises issues for the EU, not for me at this dispatch box. It is for them to consider. But the key point, which the Honourable Lady outlines, is that we are a sovereign equal in these negotiations. And I think that once the EU accepts that and looks at these negotiations from that perspective, we can make some progress on those remaining tough issues.
We're going over to Northern Ireland, to Claire Hanna. Claire Hanna.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Minister, in the Chamber on the 20th of May, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster said that the UK was now prioritising the principle of consent, their interpretation of it. In relation to the command paper on the Ireland Protocol on the same day, the government insisted that the Northern Ireland Assembly should have the final say on the protocol. Minister, the Assembly finally gave a say on Brexit, voting last week to request an extension to the transition period to allow businesses to adapt who are currently in the fight of their lives on COVID, and to give them the certainty that the Minister refers to. If the Northern Ireland Assembly's consent is so vital, should the government not listen to what it says?
Minister.
Look, many of the issues, and including the protocol, will ultimately rest with the people of Northern Ireland through their elected representatives. But for the reasons that I've already set out, we will not extend the transition period. We believe that it would not be in any part of the UK's interest to do so. It would just prolong negotiations, and honourable members on all sides of this House, including recently joined members, will know what that looks like, having seen what happened to this country over the last few years.
Jo Gideon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The people of Stoke-on-Trent, who voted overwhelmingly for Brexit, expect the extension not to happen. a comprehensive free trade agreement could easily be agreed by both parties without major difficulties in the time available. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the EU must accept that the UK is an independent sovereign state and an equal partner in these negotiations?
Well, the Honourable Lady makes some very good points. Yes, absolutely, we are a sovereign equal, and the EU must accept that. But also, she is right to point to the fact that we're not starting from scratch in these negotiations. There are many precedents being set, and the asks that we are making are extremely reasonable and found in many other arrangements that the EU has with other nations.
Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Farmers and crofters in my constituency and across the country require a minimum of two things from these negotiations. They require continued tariff-free access to the European markets, and they require the protection for their produce that they get from the PDO regimes. Given the progress of negotiations that the Minister has described, how likely does she think they are to get that, and what would she suggest they do if they don't?
Well, we are very aware of the asks of every sector in Scotland, and I have been working with all of the devolved administrations to ensure that they are able to feed in, and indeed those discussions have materially changed the shape of the negotiations, and we will continue to do that. They know that I am committed to doing that. And I think that many of the things that we are asking for are in everyone's interests. They are mutually beneficial things, and so I remain optimistic.
Felicity Buchan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Financial services are very important to my constituency and indeed to the country as a whole, given their huge contribution to the Exchequer and the number of people they employ, not only in London, but also in Scotland and the north of England. Will my right honourable friend assure me that the interests of financial services will be protected as part of the negotiations?
Well, I can give the Honourable Lady those assurances. We are obviously working very hard to deliver for that sector, a sector which was not well served. The whole of services not well served by our previous relationship with the EU. And the asks that we are making with regard to financial services are in other agreements, particularly notably Japan, that the EU has. And so we think it is perfectly reasonable that they are extended to us.
Nick Smith.
Mr Speaker, Blaenau Gwent has a European-based car parts manufacturer in Ebervale which provides well-paid jobs. What engagement has the government had with this sector and its trade unions about their role in these negotiations?
Well, I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his question. One of the areas that I look after in the Cabinet Office is our communications, and we have had a complete overhaul involving every government department, including local government and transport, which will be key to the sector that he raises, to improve our communications. Clearly, a lot of policy announcements are yet to happen because they have been contingent on decisions that have been taken, but that structure is now in place. So I make the commitment that the communications between all sectors and government will be considerably better on what happened last year.
Nikki Aitken.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. What assurances can my right honourable friend give to businesses in the cities of London and Westminster that both the UK and the EU are keen to have certainty and clarity in any future relationship, particularly to deliver an attractive business and investment environment, thinking that the financial and professional services will be playing a huge part in the post-COVID-19 economic recovery?
Well, the Honourable Lady raises an extremely good point. The City of London is not just vital to the UK's economic recovery, but also a key institution for many nations around the world, and we must ensure its success. And I can assure her that the government is very focused on that.
Emma Lewis-Buck.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I voted for the withdrawal agreement bill. I want the government to get a good deal. Delay will only increase uncertainty. But last week it was reported that talks about the oven-ready deal have stagnated. So what red lines will the government compromise, if at all, to achieve that promised deal?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her commitment to helping us deliver a good deal. The key aspect of why we can't let these negotiations go on is that prolonged uncertainty. We believe that our asks are very reasonable, there are precedents set, they are upholding our rights in international law, and we will be continuing to ask for them. What is required is for the EU to understand that we are a sovereign equal in these negotiations, and I hope that that happens in the coming weeks.
Julian Smith.
I welcome the Minister's comments on speed. We need to give people notice and businesses notice as soon as possible the changes that they need to prepare for. And on guidance, could I urge her to look at the fact that many businesses haven't realised the consequences of coming out of the single market and the customs union, and we can start preparing them for that reality. On the issue of the Northern Ireland Protocol, there are businesses reporting to me that they are now moving jobs to the Republic. What progress has been made on implementing and discussing the checks and other measures that businesses will have to prepare for in Northern Ireland?
Well, I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for that important question. In addition to very shortly being able to talk more about border operations and how we envisage things working in the future, we are already in discussion with businesses in every part of the UK. The Secretary of State for Northern Ireland has led some of those discussions. We have received a great deal of submissions from businesses from Northern Ireland, and those views are being taken into account as we design what the future will look like.
Patrick Grady.
Mr. Speaker, the London mayoral elections have been delayed by a year. The COP climate conference has been delayed by more than a year. Where is the harm in delaying the Brexit negotiations for a year as well, so that they can get it right, understanding the impact that the pandemic is having and will continue to be having at the end of the year, rather than going barrelling off the cliff edge? All it would take is a phone call and give people the kind of certainty that we're being asked for by just taking the time to get it done properly.
Well, we won't be barrelling off a cliff edge. Part of the reason why we want to conclude the negotiations is to give people time to prepare for the end of the year. But he's right to point to the fact that the situation we're in with COVID has been a grave one, and we need to ensure that our economies recover swiftly. I think they will be helped by that in not perpetuating the uncertainty we saw over the last few years, enabling business to get on with it, and using our finite resources to facilitate the levelling up in the United Kingdom, not in paying into an EU budget, which we will never see any upside from.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have recently seen an unacceptable increase in the number of illegal migrants entering this country through unauthorised crossings across the English Channel. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that being tied to EU rules and regulations during a transition period makes the return of illegal migrants more difficult, and that this underlines one of the important reasons why we need to end the transition period on the 31st of December? And will she assure me that my constituents today that the UK will rebuff any EU attempt to make a new deal on illegal immigration contingent on us conceding in other areas of negotiations?
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his question. This is an appalling and dangerous trade in human beings, and all nations have an obligation to combat it. Britain has chosen to do that very largely in part because of our geographic location in large amounts of funding upstream to create job security and food security and alleviate the need for people to move away from their homes to seek a better life. We will always uphold our obligations and our humanitarian obligations, and we want all other countries to do the same.
Steve McCabe.
When does the Minister hope to be able to offer some reassurance to the West Midlands motor industry that the negotiations will protect the industry and won't result in a disastrous tariff being imposed on UK manufactured vehicles intended for European export?
Well, on that and many other matters, this is a reason why we want to increase the pace of negotiations. But also, it will be very soon when we will also be able to talk about some of the operational aspects of how we see our border working and many other issues that will be of interest to that sector. As I say, in preparation for that, we've done a huge amount of work to ensure that we're talking to everyone who we need to.
Heading up to the northwest into Cheshire with Dr. Kieran Mullen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The reality is that a comprehensive free trade agreement is well within reach with all the benefits that it could bring to both parties. Rather than discussing an extension with opposition parties, does my right honourable friend agree with me that the EU should focus on securing a deal so that we can reach an agreement by the end of the year?
Well, I do agree with the honourable gentleman. It is vital that we get a move on with this. It's in the UK and the EU's interest that we do so. It must accept that we are a sovereign equal in these negotiations. Then I think we will make some progress. But in fairness to the opposition, even though they are campaigning on a transition period, they've not quite adopted that as their policy, I suspect, because they know it would be crazy to extend it.
Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Scotland's got important trading links with Northern Ireland, but due to COVID, Stena Line's really struggling just now. The Minister keeps talking about certainty, so in terms of looking for uncertainty, can she be the First Minister that explains how the invisible border between Northern Ireland and Ireland is going to be maintained, what technology has been invented and will be deployed in time for the end of the transition period, and how we should ensure that doesn't impact the movement of goods and people between Scotland and Northern Ireland?
Well, the honourable gentleman raises some very important points. Very soon we will be able to talk in depth about border operations. I'm not able to do that today, but he will not have long to wait.
The nature of the trading relationship that the UK is now seeking with the EU means that whatever the outcome of the negotiations, the formalities which exporters will need to comply with will change on the 1st of January. So can I urge the government to step up engagement so businesses across the country, large and small, are ready for the end of the transition period and all the formalities that that will bring?
The Right Honourable Lady makes an incredibly important point that is absolutely accepted. We hope to be able to start doing that very soon indeed. And in advance of that, as I have alluded to, we have done a tremendous amount of work looking at all of the stakeholders that departments are working with, ensuring that we're talking to all the businesses that we need to, not just the obvious ones that are always at the round tables. And we do a very good job of communicating that, but also listening, because many of the solutions that need to be put in place will be derived from the ideas from those businesses themselves.
We go over to the member for Huddersfield with Barry Sherman. Barry Sherman.
Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable Lady, I'm sure will agree with me that we need a good deal. We need a deal in the time that we've set ourselves. But to get that, we need a mixture of trust and competence and integrity. And as a new member of the Leaving Europe Select Committee, I've had the privilege yesterday of interviewing Michel Barnier with the team and with interviewing her boss, the Secretary of State. And can I tell her, that does it not worry her that I get the real feeling that the trust and the competence and integrity is more on the Barnier side than on her boss's side? And why can't we get a movement where we look back to the political declaration and stick to its principles?
Well, I'm very disappointed to hear that from the honourable gentleman. On the Withdrawal Agreement Joint Committee, I am Barnier's oppo, and I thought I was charming.
Dr. Liam Fox.
Mr. Speaker, no one would disagree with that sentiment. Post-COVID, it will be essential to get the global trading system moving. And nothing could give greater confidence in that system than seeing a UK-EU trade agreement in place. To enable that to happen, the EU could give Britain a Canada-style agreement. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the UK has a right to expect from the EU no less than the UK itself agreed as part of the EU with Canada?
Well, the right honourable gentleman makes a very good point, which I agree with wholeheartedly, and he is right to also put the focus on rest of world trade. Clearly, many decisions that would be taken in negotiations and on the work streams going into the implementing the withdrawal agreement are linked to our future ambitions with rest of world trade. And we must always remember in this place, whilst the EU side of things is clearly a priority for many in this House, we ought to also be talking about the other opportunities that exist with other nations around the world.
Jim Shannon. Thank you, Mr Speaker, and congratulate the Minister on her stance and determination to deliver Brexit. Will the Minister outline if there has been further discussions regarding our agri-food and fishing sectors in the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland in particular, with special reference to the protection needed to secure our dairy, our beef, our pork, our poultry and the fish markets? And what has the latest discussions brought about to ensure that that happens?
Well, the last round of negotiations touched on all of the work streams. There was in-depth discussion across all areas, very constructive on both parts. But as I outlined in my opening statement, there are some very tough areas. One of them is fishing. And we are asking for our rights enshrined in international law to be upheld. And we are not wavering from that point. The EU needs to recognise that.
30 withdrawn. Justin Mabbers.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In my last exchange with the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster on the 27th of February, we learnt we are going to need 50,000 new customs officers by the end of the year. What assessment has the Department made of the annual cost to the UK economy of these officers, and who is going to foot the bill for them?
Well, on both in terms of personnel, training, recruitment, but on many other aspects that will need to be put in place. Our civil servants have been working through all of those. There are regular updates on readiness with our partners and with the devolved nations. I am leading on that aspect. And where there are additional costs to be borne, it is work that needs to be done, and the Treasury is aware of that fact. What I am personally keen to see is that where we are making investments, whether it is in personnel or whether it is in additional facilities that needed to be created, we are also looking at the economic opportunities that will come with that for particular areas, and I know that the Treasury is very keen on that too.
We're heading up to Chesham and Amersham with Dame Cheryl Gillan. Dame Cheryl.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. With both sides being confident that a deal can take place by the end of the year, the EU ratification process actually means that in practical terms, agreement probably needs to have been reached by the end of October. Now, ratification in the UK can take place relatively quickly. Can I ask the Minister what guarantee she's received from Michel Barnier that the EU will not allow a deal to fall because of the time it will take to complete the very complex EU ratification processes?
Well, all sides are very aware of the timetable that we have to operate in. This is why we want to increase the pace of discussions and focus on those remaining tough issues. But we are not going to extend the negotiations, and we are determined to ensure that any ratification, any practical measures that need to be put in place can be done so by the end of the year. That is absolutely critical, and that is why we want to conclude these negotiations swiftly.
Stephen Ferry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Northern Ireland Protocol is a sad and inevitable consequence of Brexit and the resultant need to protect the Good Friday Agreement. But it is right that we do all that we can to mitigate its impact. So does the Minister recognise that the greater the level of divergence by the UK from the EU, or indeed the absence of any trade deal by the end of this year, then the greater the impact we're going to see down the Irish Sea in terms of checks and bureaucracy.
Well, I think the best way to protect the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and the best way to implement the protocol is to take a very pragmatic approach that always has at the forefront of it jobs and the economy in Northern Ireland. That is why it is our policy that there should be no new procedures, there should be no new customs infrastructure, there should be no tariffs on internal UK trade, and that remains our policy.
James Wyle. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that even the 5 months that Michel Barnier talked about on Friday in order to finalise legal text on an agreement is possible on level playing field, fisheries and other matters, provided that agreement reflects that we've left the EU, and isn't what's needed here the flexibility in the EU mandate that we saw when the Prime Minister successfully renegotiated the withdrawal agreement?
Well, I agree with my honourable friend wholeheartedly. Remember, we are not starting from scratch on these things. There are many existing precedents, and I think it is perfectly possible for us to make progress, and I sincerely hope we do so.
Heading up into Scotland with Kirstin Oswald. Kirstin Oswald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster told me we don't need a Brexit extension, just goodwill on all sides. But this government keeps making commitments and then ditching them, hardly the way to encourage goodwill. So will the UK government finally admit it can't deliver its own commitments and just come clean? The real strategy is to crash out of the EU, leaving the rest of us to pick up the pieces.
No, that is not the strategy. The strategy is to escalate the pace of these negotiations, which the EU is aware is required, and make progress. As I say, in the last rounds that took place last week, we did have very constructive discussions on all work streams, but there are those remaining areas that we really need to focus on in the coming days and weeks. That's what we need to do. It's in everyone's interests that we secure this deal, not just for us in the UK, but for the EU as well. And I remain confident that we will get there.
Brendan Clark-Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A historic immigration bill will end free movement, take back control of our borders and pave the way for a new points-based immigration system. Does the Minister agree that as we come through the coronavirus, it is vital we have this new immigration system in place to allow us to attract the brightest and the best from around the world?
We need flexibility. We need to be able to respond to what our economy needs. And that, with regard to immigration, needs to be based on a proper understanding of our own labour market and the needs of each local area. So yes, that will present us with opportunities, and we need to be ready to seize them.
Munira Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The CBI says that coronavirus has left companies with almost zero resilience to a chaotic exit from the single market. Ending the Brexit transition period without a deal on its own would be an act of economic vandalism. To do so in the face of coronavirus would be economic vandalism on steroids. Yeah. This is no longer about leave or remain, it's about a government acting responsibly in the interests of its citizens. So will the Minister please just put ideology aside and persuade her colleagues it's time to seek an extension to the transition period?
Yeah. All that seeking that extension would do is to prolong negotiations. We need to conclude the negotiations. We need to get a good outcome, and not pushing deadlines out is going to help do that. And then we need to give our citizens and our businesses time to prepare, time to socialise them with the new border operations. That is our plan. That is what is going to happen. All that extending the transition process would do is push negotiations out, and we would be back to where I can tell you the British people do not want to be, which is uncertainty and chaos. They want clarity, they want to get a move on, and they want to maximise the benefits of being outside the EU.
Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Isn't this the only trade deal in history that actually starts out from a level playing field? And shouldn't that make it much easier for us to find a pragmatic way forward?
Well, my right honourable friend makes a very good point, and there are, I mean, it's not just the fact that we have been in this partnership with the European Union, but also that their arrangements with other nations set the parameters for many of the things that we are discussing, and this is perfectly doable. It is just goodwill and focus, but there is goodwill and there is increasing focus.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Time is running out, and there is a real risk of a cliff edge Brexit, which would come in the context of a health pandemic and the associated economic crisis, with rising unemployment towards the end of the year. Can the Minister confirm if the government has initiated any planning in the event of a deal not being reached?
Minister. It would be prudent and wise for us to prepare for every scenario, just as we have always done, just as we did last year, and did not need to implement those preparations. But I am confident that we can not only come to an agreement, but also we can do so in a time frame that gives people the time that they need to prepare, to understand. And we are, of course, very aware of the other things that are going on in the world that form the backdrop to that. Our approach is going to be achingly pragmatic.
Stephen Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The EU says repeatedly that it accepts the fact of Brexit, yet its entire negotiating strategy seems to be geared to keeping the UK squarely in the legal and regulatory orbit of the EU. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that unlocking a deal, yes, it will require flexibility, it will require goodwill, but it also fundamentally requires the EU to be realistic and honest about the path that the UK has chosen?
I think that the right honourable gentleman makes very good points, and that is what the EU needs to recognise. It needs to recognise that we are now a sovereign equal, and it needs to negotiate with us on that basis. I think there are massive opportunities from us coming to a deal. They will be aware of those opportunities, and I hope that we can get the focus that we need to resolve these remaining issues and get a move on for their union and ours too.
Heading back up to Scotland with Neil Hanvey. Neil Hanvey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister talks about time to prepare, yet this House has absolutely no clarity on where or how we will land, and businesses the length and breadth of the UK still do not know what tariffs will apply, which regulations they should follow, what customs processes will apply, how people and data can cross borders, or whether professional qualifications will be recognised. Can the Minister honestly look business owners in my constituency and across Scotland in the eye and tell them they're meant to prepare all of this in the next 6 months while battling the impacts of a global pandemic?
Well, we are very aware of the backdrop against which these negotiations are taking place. With regard to border operations, as I have said, honourable members will not have long to wait before they will learn more about that. But on many of the areas the honourable gentleman made, we have made progress, and that progress is in the public domain. And on other areas, we are simply asking for a reciprocal relationship for things that we currently do for other nations.
Heading to Essex with Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we begin to recover from the coronavirus, and while a deal would be very welcome, does my right honourable friend agree that the UK needs as much flexibility as possible to help rebuild our economy and communities, and remaining bound by EU law during this time would not allow us to do that?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. We have left the European Union. At the end of this year, we will be a fully independent and sovereign nation. Our interests are best served by having that flexibility with rest of world trade, but also with the choices we make about our trading arrangements with others and as well as the EU. That is the basis of our negotiating position, and it is one that we will hold to.
Heading over the border to Wales with Howell Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Is it not now inevitable that both Northern Ireland and Irish companies alike will increasingly look to using the new generation of massive roll-on, roll-off ferries for direct links with the mainland in Europe? And that's with disastrous effects for bypassed Welsh ports such as Holyhead.
Minister.
Well, I would reassure the honourable gentleman, as somebody who their own constituency is a port, that I very much understand the concerns that the sector has. They want information about future operations. They want support to put in place any adjustments that need to be made, and they want timely information about that. A tremendous amount of work has gone on with those ports and the organisations that they work with and rely on in advance of any announcements about border operations and future arrangements, as he will know, and we will continue to do that. We have to maximise the economic opportunities such investments in UK infrastructure will bring for his constituents and others around the country, and we will do that.
Richard Holden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A comprehensive free trade agreement can easily be reached by the end of the year between the UK and the European Union for one simple reason, and that's because we're starting from the same place. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that it's time for the European Union to get on with it and start negotiating in good faith?
Yeah.
Well, I think that behind the political bluster there is good faith, because as well as the right honourable gentleman pointing out we're starting from similar positions, that a good deal is in our mutual interests, which is why I've always remained optimistic about the outcome for this process, because the European Union needs to recognise us as a sovereign equal, and I hope that they do.
Right, we head over to the border again into Scotland with Margaret Farrier. Margaret Farrier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. World trade is forecast to decline by up to a third in 2020 due to the coronavirus pandemic, and this could encourage a move to more protectionist trade policies globally. Against that context, why does the Minister think it's a good idea to rush through major changes to the UK's trading relationship with the EU when businesses want more time to recover from the economic shock of coronavirus and avoid a no-deal scenario?
Are you all right, Minister, with that? Yeah.
Apologies to the honourable lady, you were cutting out, but I think I've got the gist. I mean, we believe in free trade. We do not want protectionist practices, not just because that's in our interest, but we believe it is in the interests of every nation on earth. But I can assure the honourable lady that one reason why we do not want to extend the transition period and we want to conclude the negotiations swiftly is to give businesses and her constituents time to prepare before the end of the year. And our approach to that on our borders and on many other aspects is going to be extremely pragmatic and sensible. And once business hears more about it, I think it will be reassured.
Robbie Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many constituents from across Keighley have expressed to me their frustration at the speed in which the EU are progressing with these negotiations. My right honourable friend has been clear that we need to see a significant step from the EU's approach if we are going to reach an agreement by the end of this year. Can she confirm that the government is prepared to walk away from these negotiations if adequate process has not been made, and that we are prepared for the eventuality if needs be?
Well, my honourable friend makes some very good points. But the key aspect to this is, as I've said, is the timing. There is no point in us arriving at an agreement at the 11th hour. We have to arrive at agreement to enable it to be implemented, ratified, but also for our citizens and businesses to prepare. That is what is dictating the timetable here. And that is why we must have renewed focus. And we're talking to the EU about having a change of format, about how we can increase the pace of negotiations, get the focus where we need it to be, quickly and get a deal done for both of our sakes.
Easy extradition has made it possible for paedophiles, murderers, violent criminals to be brought to justice in the UK from other countries in the European Union. I understand the government has given up on the European arrest warrant now for the UK. Several countries have made it clear that constitutionally they will not be able to extradite to the UK when we're no longer a member of the European Union, including Germany, Austria and Slovenia. How are we going to make sure that we do not become a protective place for European criminals?
Well, I can tell the right honourable gentleman that on that issue, but on many other issues as well related to law enforcement and security, the negotiations have been good. They have been good and constructive, and we were having discussions on those areas last week and making good progress on them. Ultimately, though, having an arrangement, whether it is on other aspects of security or whether it is on protecting all of our citizens from those who would wish to do them harm, that is in our mutual interests. I've said this since the get-go, since the referendum, and I'm confident common sense will prevail.
Jerome Megan.
Having a deadline promotes deals, and I have high hopes for the negotiations over the next few weeks. But does my right honourable friend agree with me that where there is no sign of a convergence in negotiating positions, an extension of the transition period 4.5 years after the referendum vote would serve no useful purpose other than to cost us money, prolong business uncertainty, delay effective control of our borders and hamper our economic response to the COVID crisis?
Honourable gentleman is damn right.
We now go over to Greater Manchester with Andrew Gwynn. Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you. But one of the concerns has always been the potential for a future British government to deregulate hard-fought workers' rights. That ought not to be a worry if there's political will. So has the government met with trade unions and the TUC about maintaining and indeed improving our employment standards outside of the EU once the transition period ends in December?
Well, of course, both the Cabinet Office but also many other government departments have negotiations with a wide range of stakeholders, including the unions. What I would say to him is that the British people value those things that he has spoken about. They value their rights. They value high standards. They value high environmental standards and all the other things that many members care about because they know their constituents care about. And on these things, including particularly on employment law, the UK has led the pack. So I would say have a little faith. If, it is the honourable gentleman's job not to trust the government, but he should trust the people.
Final question from John Lamont.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I know the Minister will understand that many of Scotland's fishermen voted to leave the European Union to retake control of our fishing waters. So can the Minister assure me that the UK will not compromise on our fishing rights and the EU will need to accept that the UK will become an independent coastal nation by the end of 2020?
I can give the honourable gentleman that reassurance. We want a separate fisheries framework which reflects our rights in international law. Our requests are simple, reasonable and straightforward, and we want the EU to recognise those rights, recognise us as a sovereign equal and come to the negotiating table with renewed vigour to ensure that we can get that agreement and a deal.
In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next, I am now suspending the House for 3 minutes. Order.
Order. Statement, Secretary of State for Education, Gavin Williamson.
With permission, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to make a statement regarding the wider opening of nurseries, schools and colleges as part of our response to the COVID-19 pandemic. It is now over 2.5 months since we asked schools, further education colleges and nurseries to remain open only for vulnerable children and those of critical workers. I continue to be immensely grateful for the way that our teachers and parents have responded to these challenging circumstances. I'd also like to say a very big thank you to all those working in education, childcare and children's social care for the huge efforts that they're making on a daily basis to support families and make sure our children don't miss out on their education. We all know how important it is for children and young people to be in education and childcare, and it is vital that we get them back there as soon as the scientific advice indicates that we can. I'm very pleased that last week we were able to take the first cautious step towards that. As the Prime Minister confirmed on the 28th of May, the government's 5 tests are being met, and we're beginning to ease the lockdown restrictions across England. Based on all the evidence, this means that nurseries and other early year providers, including childminders, have been able to welcome back children of all ages. Pupils in reception, Year 1 and Year 6, have been returning in smaller class sizes, alongside the children of critical workers and vulnerable children of all ages, who continue to be able to attend. Mr. Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, 97% of schools that submitted data to the Department for Education were open at the end of last week. Last week, we saw the number of primaries taking nursery reception Year 1 or Year 6 pupils steadily rise as part of a phased, cautious, wider reopening of schools. By the end of the week, more than half of primary schools were taking pupils from these year groups, and as of yesterday, that had risen to over 70% of primaries that had responded. I know that schools need time to put in place the strict protective measures we have asked for, and we continue to work with the sector to make sure that any schools experiencing difficulties are supported to open more widely as soon as it is possible. Some schools in areas such as the North West are concerned about local rates of transmission. I can assure them that SAGE's estimate for the whole of the UK is below 1. If robust data shows that local action needs to be taken, we will not hesitate to do so, but we are not in that position. I know you'll be as impressed as I have been by the work and efforts of head teachers, teachers and childcare staff who are finding ways to make the necessary changes while still ensuring schools and nurseries are a welcoming place for children, as well as reassuring families who may be worried about sending their children back. The next step of our phased approach will enable secondary schools and colleges to provide some face-to-face support from the 15th of June for years 10 and years 12, and 16 to 19 students in the first year of a 2-year study programme who are due to take key exams next year. This is such a critical time for those students, and this extra support will be in addition to their remote education, which will continue to be the main method of education for them this term. As only a quarter of this cohort will be able to attend at any one time in order to limit the risk of transmission. Children of critical workers and vulnerable children in all secondary year groups will continue to be able to attend full-time. We have published guidance for secondary schools and ensured schools have the flexibility to decide how they want to use face-to-face support in the best interests of their pupils. Since the announcement of our proposals on the 10th of May, my department has published detailed guidance for settings on how to prepare. This includes planning guides for early years providers and for primary schools, and for further guidance for secondary schools and colleges as well. Crucially, we have provided detailed guidance on the protective measures that schools and other settings need to take to reduce the risk of transmission. This includes restricting class sizes, limiting mixing between groups, and encouraging regular hand washing and frequent cleaning. This advice was developed in close consultation with Public Health England. The safety of our children, young people and staff remains my top priority. That's why all staff and children, including the under 5s, will have access to testing if they develop symptoms of coronavirus. This will enable the right response where a case is confirmed, including using a test and trace approach to rapidly identify people most at risk of having been exposed to the virus so that they can take action too. We continue to follow the best scientific advice and believe that this cautious, phased return is the most sensible course of action to take. While we are not able to welcome all primary children back for a full month before the summer, we continue to work with the sector on the next steps, where we'd like to see schools who have the capacity to bring back more children in those smaller class sizes, to do so if they are able to do before the summer holidays. We will be working to bring all children back to school in September. I know students who are due to take exams in 2021 will have experienced considerable disruption to their education this year, and we are committed to doing all we can to minimise the effects of this. Exams will take place next year, and we're working with Ofqual and the exam boards on our approach to these. While these are the first steps, they are the best way to ensure all children can get back into the classroom as soon as possible. I want to end by thanking the Childcare, school and FE staff who have gone above and beyond over the past 8 weeks and who are now working so incredibly hard to welcome our children and young people back, while also continuing to support those who remain at home. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Secretary of State Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary for advance sight of his statement, and I join him in thanking parents and all those working in education and childcare at this difficult time. For weeks, head teachers, education unions, school staff and many parents have warned that the plan to open whole primary schools before the summer was simply impractical while implementing social distancing safely. So I welcome the Secretary's decision to roll back from that today. However, I must state my dismay at the way this has been handled. If the government had brought together everyone involved in implementing these plans from the outset and really taken on board what they had to say, they would not be in the situation of having to roll back at all. But what's done is done. And now it is imperative the government looks ahead to what the education system needs over the coming months and years. Children and young people's education and well-being will have been impacted cruelly by such a prolonged period away from school. Their friends and the situation at home may have been extremely stressful. Indeed, the Children's Commissioner has said to me today, "The risk I am most concerned about is that of a generation of children losing over 6 months of formal education, socialising with friends and structured routine. I'm also concerned about a deepening education disadvantage gap that could leave millions of children without education they need to progress in life. The government need to face up to the scale of damage this is doing to children and scale up their response. The starting point for this needs to be the rapid action to support summer schemes for this summer. Like the Commissioner, I believe a crisis in education and children's attainment and well-being could come at us incredibly quickly if we do not step in and mitigate it now. There needs to be a national plan for education. So will the Secretary commit today to bringing together children's organisations, trade unions, parents' associations, health and psychological experts, Ofqual, school leaders and head teachers to develop that plan? Of course, the Secretary will say he has met with these groups. However, politely listening to concerns and not acting on most of them is very different to the creation of a formal task force where these groups play a key role in setting the principles of a national plan. In the immediate term, will the Secretary consider issuing guidance that all children of compulsory school age should have a one-on-one meeting with a teacher from their school and parents, if appropriate, before the summer holidays start? Alongside that support, will the Secretary commit to increasing the resources available for summer schemes to help re-engage children socially and emotionally? In terms of academic support, the Government must support blended learning with more resources, targeted tuition, significantly increased support for disadvantaged children, including considering a greatly enhanced pupil premium, roll out devices and free access to internet to all pupils who need them. And for those in years 10 and 12 who are worried sick about their exams next year, the Government must work with Ofqual to redesign GCSE and A-level qualifications to reflect the impact time away from school has had. Longer term, the plan must cover all possible scenarios, including the possibility of a second wave. Not least, Public Health England confirmed on Friday that the R rate was over 1 in some regions. Indeed, the Government has set out that keeping below 1 is critical in stopping the spread of the virus, but the Government does not appear to have issued any direction to schools in those regions. So what is the Secretary's safety advice? Should they pause plans for wider reopening? Do they need to take additional measures? Or is it acceptable to simply carry on bringing in additional pupils with an R rate above 1? Of course, the Secretary today infers the latter, that local action does not need to be taken, so I ask him to publish the scientific modelling to support such an assertion and reassure schools in these regions. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Government has confirmed that the free school meal voucher scheme will not continue over the summer holidays. With 200,000 more children expected to be living below the poverty line by the end of the year as job losses hit family incomes, this is a deeply callous move by the Government. Will the Secretary of State change his mind today and commit to funding free school meals over the summer holidays?
Secretary of State.
Well, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I would hope that the Honourable lady opposite and myself are completely united in our concern to making sure that there is not a generation of children that miss out. And we recognise and we understand the truly extraordinary times that we're living in, and we're asking both children to learn in and teachers to teach in and all those who support them. But what we do recognise is that we do need to be bringing schools back and pupils back into the classroom. If it had been left to the Honourable lady, she would not have been bringing children back into the classroom until the National Education Union said that she was allowed to do so. And while we will continue to work with all, we recognise how important it is, how incredibly important it is to do the best for every single child. And that's why it's so welcome to see so many schools opening their doors, welcoming children in, and actually giving them the very best of what they can offer. She raises an important point about summer schemes, but I would say that we need to lift our eyes higher and to be more ambitious. She is right to highlight the fact that there are challenges, real challenges that children have suffered as a consequence of this lockdown. But to put this right, we need to take a longer-term approach of how we can support children over a longer period of time. And that is what we will be working towards, and that is what we will be delivering. And yes, we will be working, and we continue to work, with groups and organisations right across the spectrum to make sure that the policies are evidence-based and they are going to deliver for children, because we are not going to be doing virtue signalling. We are going to be taking the actions that are going to make a real improvement and a real difference to children's lives. And she is right. to highlight the importance of working with Ofqual, and that is what we're doing, including with representative organisations of schools and teachers, to make sure that those children who are going to be facing exams next year, whether that's at GCSE, whether that's A-level, whether that's T-levels, or whether that's BTECs and other qualifications, to ensure that those exams are fair and reflect their hard work that they've been doing. And the Honourable Lady mentioned the issue of SAGE and their data and Public Health England. That is not something that is within my control, as they are an independent body. SAGE regularly publish all their data that they're doing, and they'll be doing so with reference to this. But in terms of local authorities, right across the country, whether it's in the northwest or whether it's in the northeast, southeast, the southwest, we'll work with all local authorities where they have concerns, work with them and Public Health England so they get the best advice. Because the interests of children, the interests of those who work in schools are my primary interest and my focus in making sure that we can bring schools back. And of course, we'll work with those local authorities, but we do start to need to bring all schools back in every part of this country. And if the evidence starts to point to the fact that we'll have to close schools down in small clusters as a result of this, then obviously that is the action that we'd take, but only on the best advice from PHE. And at the moment, the advice from PHE and SAGE is that all schools can open and they should open.
We now go to the Chair of the Education Select Committee, Robert Halfon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Why is it that we can turn a blind eye to thousands of demonstrators campaign for pubs and garden centres to open, yet it is so hard to reopen our schools? We know that around 700,000 disadvantaged children are not doing school homework and 700,000 don't have proper access to computers for the internet. So what is the government doing to help these disadvantaged children learn again and avoid an epidemic of educational poverty? Can we have a long-term plan for education for a catch-up premium to look after these left-behind children? And will he also reconsider ensuring that these children get free school meals over the summer, given the financial anxieties their families have to face during the current pandemic?
Secretary of State.
Well, my right honourable friend will be aware that we're already in the process of rolling out IT equipment right across the school estate, as well as to those children who are most vulnerable. 100,000 of those laptops have already been distributed to children who are most vulnerable and most disadvantaged. And we took the decision to ensure that they were prioritised over and above schools, those children who have social workers. We've got a further 75,000 computers that are going to be distributed to schools over the coming weeks, and we're on schedule to distribute the full 230,000 of those computers over the coming month as on schedule. But my right honourable friend is right to highlight the fact that we do need a long-term plan. That is what we're doing. We recognise that the learning loss is not something that is going to be corrected just over a few weeks, but this is an action that needs to be taken over a long period of time, and that's the approach we're taking.
Now go to Carol Monaghan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of this statement. Lourdes Secondary in Glasgow tragically lost 2 pupils this week. I'm sure the whole House will join me in offering our condolences to their families, friends and the entire school community at Lourdes. During the urgent question on school reopening last month, I asked the Secretary of State where, with a maximum of 15 pupils per class, the additional rooms and teachers were coming from. He stuck his head in the sand, ignored my questions, the concerns raised by the teaching profession and those of parents. So it's no surprise that we're back here less than 4 weeks later to find that the government's own social distancing rules make it impossible for primary schools in England to admit all pupils before the summer holidays. But why is it taking the government so long to recognise what was blindingly obvious? What is needed now is a proper plan for education, along the lines been developed by the Scottish Government. This should cover all possible scenarios and focus on blended learning with greatly increased support for disadvantaged children. Is he planning, as Scotland has done, to use public buildings such as libraries and council offices to relieve pressure on classroom space? What consultation will take place with the teaching profession to ensure the government's plans for reopening are realistic? Will he commit to publishing modelling of the increased number of COVID cases that could potentially be seen in school-based staff as a result of reopening the schools? And finally, will he ensure that any decisions taken are based on published scientific advice and with the agreement of local councils and school leaders, rather than simply forcing through what has been described as delivering the impossible?
Secretary of State.
Well, I very much join with the Honourable Lady in passing on my deep condolences, not just to the families, but to the schools and the communities that have lost loved ones, as she highlighted at the start of her question. We will continue to work with teachers' unions as well as school representative organisations as we look to expand the number of children who are able to attend primary schools, as well as we continue with the expansion of more pupils attending schools, including years 10 and 12 and those in further education colleges, which will be starting from the week commencing the 15th of June next week. And as we welcome more children into the classroom, as we welcome more children having the opportunity to learn in different year groups, we'll see the real benefit of how the children are able to have that opportunity to be with their teachers, be with their friends once more. Now, the Honourable Lady is right to highlight the fact that we do have limitations of, while we have a limit of 15 children per class, that obviously does limit the amount of ability to have as many year groups in school as we'd like. But as this is changed and as this is modified, this will give us the ability to slowly and cautiously move forward in terms of welcoming more children back to school when that is the right time.
Tim Lawson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Every 2 months represents more than 1% of a child's childhood, and come September, many children would have been out of school for almost 6 months, and we fear it may be even longer. And the impact on those from the most deprived backgrounds will be considerable. So can I ask the Secretary of State, therefore, that he looks at catch-up schemes over the summer, perhaps using NCS youth workers who've been stood down from the summer programme, and over the next year looks at mobilising the many students who are now delaying going to university, who will find it hard to travel or hard to get a job, to get them to work alongside some of these children in a national mentoring scheme modelled on the charity City Year, for example.
Secretary of State.
I think my honourable friend makes an important point, and this is certainly what we are looking at, but we're looking at something much more wide and much more long-term, because we don't believe that actually just purely looking at the summer period is enough in order to be able to assist children to get the catch-up that they truly need.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State was talking about the availability of laptops and computer equipment to disadvantaged pupils. 2 months ago, the Secretary of State promised there would be that equipment. Having spoken to my schools this morning, they've not received any. And whilst the government will talk easily about a levelling up agenda, it's quite clear where private schools have access to that sort of equipment, as do their staff. It is not available in our state sector. So is it the case then that the public rightly believes that the government is failing them?
Secretary of State.
Well, I do apologise to the honourable gentleman. He's obviously not heard my response that I had made a little bit earlier, because where I'd explained that we'd taken a policy decision to ensure that the laptops, the first wave of laptops that we're to receive, were going to be targeted at those children who were most vulnerable and had a social worker. And the second wave of laptops that we have just been in receipt in were then going to schools and academies through local authorities or multi-academy trusts. We're on schedule to receive all of those laptops and get them distributed by the end of the month, and I'd like to take the opportunity to thank ComputerServe, who have done so much work in making sure that these have been distributed in this manner.
Duncan Baker.
Thank you. I want to thank the Secretary of State for enabling some primary school children to go back to school last week, not least because I'm a father of a 4-year-old who was desperate to get back to school, has enjoyed the education and that well-being that she needed. And I'm sure I speak for many parents across the country with that. Teachers in North Norfolk have been phenomenal in their efforts of getting students and little children back to school. What reassurances can you give, though, however, for those vulnerable children that can't go back at the moment, who are remote learning, and that they are getting an equitable education so that they don't fall further behind?
Order. Just to say, I do want to try to get everybody in, so quite short questions and short answers would do. Secretary of State.
I share my honourable friend's desire to see all children returning to school in that phased way, but as swiftly as possible as we're able to do so. But my honourable gentleman highlights some really important challenges, especially for those vulnerable children who aren't necessarily able to access education by going into school. I was particularly delighted to see the work and progress that we've made with the Oak National Academy. Just a few days ago, they had delivered over 10 million lessons to children, and as part of that package is lessons and support for children with special education needs as well.
Meg Hillier.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, a decade ago I sat in a Cabinet Office briefing room discussing the threat of the then threatened pandemic, and then we were discussing the closure of schools. So it beggars belief that the Secretary of State can come to the House today with no clear plan for getting out the laptops, which are delayed. That wasn't planned in advance. Well, it's late, Secretary of State. He shakes his head, Madam Deputy Speaker, for the record, but they are late. This is already late for vulnerable pupils, and with no clear plan about catch-up. And I find myself in complete accord with the honourable members for Harlow and for East Worthing and Shoreham in their desire to see a catch-up plan for the very many vulnerable students. Can he not seriously give us more information today? There must have been planning. If there hasn't, he's been asleep on the job.
Secretary of State.
Well, the honourable lady is inaccurate in the fact that the laptops that we had promised to actually ensure that we get out to children, vulnerable children, those who are facing exams in Year 10 are actually on schedule. We had said that they would all be distributed by the end of June, and we're on target to be able to do that. We did make the decision to prioritise those children who are most vulnerable, and I still think that was the right decision to make. And in terms of catch-up plan, this isn't about something that is just over a few weeks. This has got to be an approach over a full year and more. That is what we're putting in place. That is how we're going to be supporting children into the long term.
Danny Kruger.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. All schools and teachers have worked incredibly hard over this period, but some schools have managed to deliver whole class teaching live through video teaching, through direct teaching. Does he agree with me that, sadly, not all children in this country have received any online direct teaching at all, and many have received very little? And that is because the teaching unions have opposed this practice, often with the support of members opposite. What can we do if the return to school is going to be delayed further to ensure that more children can receive direct teaching?
Secretary of State.
We will be setting out quite clearly to all schools as to where children are not in a position to be able to return to school, as to what are the basic minimum curriculum requirements that we'll be expecting them to deliver for all children. This is what is to be expected, and we'd hope that all schools follow that. It's not just through online learning, it's about sharing resources with children, and we've seen some excellent practice, but we want to keep driving up all schools to the very highest levels of standards for all children.
Now go to Peter Grant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Education authorities in England, the people that have to implement these decisions, knew nothing about the now delayed planned return to full schooling until they were bounced into it by the government last month. So what steps has the Secretary of State taken to make sure that in future local authorities, head teachers and unions are kept fully informed about developments and that schools are given adequate time to prepare for each stage of their pupils' return?
Secretary of State.
We always have, and we'll always continue to have regular meetings with them and sharing our most up-to-date plans.
Now it is Sir David Evanet.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I appreciate that health and safety issues are paramount when deciding to reopen primary schools to all children, and I welcome the flexibility in my right honourable friend's statement today. However, I do share the concerns about the serious impact the lack of schooling will have on many disadvantaged children from poor households. I welcome his commitment that they will be a top priority. Will he reaffirm that for me?
Secretary of State.
I absolutely do reaffirm that to my right honourable friend, and the importance of making sure they're back into full-time schooling at the earliest possible moment. And we want to see, and we'll be continuing to work with schools to bring more children back into that formal education environment as swiftly as we possibly can.
Leila Moran.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would like to echo the thanks to the profession for what they have done so far. I would also like to clarify some of the numbers that the Secretary of State has been talking about. The Chair of the Select Committee said that there are 700,000 children without devices. The Secretary of State said that 100,000 had been distributed, with 230,000 still to come. 700,000 minus 100,000 minus 230,000 is 370,000 children without an internet device. Have I got that wrong? If I have, can he please clarify? And if I am right, then can he explain how this squares with prioritising the most disadvantaged children and learning?
Secretary of State.
Well, in the terms of the work that we've done, in terms of the distribution of laptops, we prioritised key groups that we felt that were most vulnerable and most in need of laptops. There's a total of 230,000 laptops that are going to be going out as part of that programme, as well as tens of thousands of routers to be able to help children from some of those most vulnerable families who maybe have some limited resources at home, but don't actually have the internet access that they really need to be able to access the online learning that we want to see them enjoy.
Now I go to Dr. Matthew Offord.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Many children commute into the Hendon constituency to access the high-quality education that is provided by the London Borough of Barnet. Those children will be required, as they travel by public transport, to wear masks and take other precautions. Can the Secretary of State outline what precautions he believes should happen for those children who use school transport provided by the local authority? Will they be required to undertake the same precautions of wearing masks in their journeys? And when they get to the school, will they simply just disregard those masks?
Secretary of State.
So in terms of public transport and home-to-school transport, people will be required to follow the same regulations on both home-to-school transport and general public transport. But the approach that we've taken to bringing schools back has had safety at the very heart of it, making sure that classes are in small bubbles to make sure that we reduce the chances of transmission, and we believe that this cautious, phased approach is the right approach.
Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I know that the Secretary of State has spent time in my constituency, and he will know that at least 1 in 3 children live in poverty in my constituency, and that they are at risk of falling furthest behind from not being in school. It's clear we need a strategic plan, just as the government have had for the economy, with the same focus. But in the meantime, I think it's really important that the Secretary of State commits today to a major campaign over the summer for a catch-up education for children, for an urgent rollout of the laptops that he's promised, and finally, and I wish he'd address this, the issue about free school meal vouchers carrying on over the summer. Please think again about that callous decision that was made last week.
Secretary of State.
As I've stated previously, we are going to be ensuring that we're not just looking at the needs of children over the summer in terms of how they can be taking those steps, working with schools so they can be catching up on the work that they've missed if they haven't been able to sustain that learning at home. But we're not just looking at the summer, but we're looking much more longer term. In terms of free school meals, we've never traditionally provided free school meals all the way through the summer. But what the DWP has been doing has been putting an extra £6.5 billion to support those families who are most vulnerable, and will continue to work with the DWP, MHCLG and DEFRA to continue to support those families who are most vulnerable.
Senator Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Across the country, children of key workers have been enabled to continue attending school. In my constituency, we have a large concentration of key workers, and in many times, schools have interpreted the rules as being that both parents have to be key workers before the children will be allowed to attend school. That's necessitated quite a lengthy discussions with head teachers and others in the schools. Can my right honourable friend confirm the position will be that children of key workers will continue to be able to attend full-time education to enable those key workers to provide the key services that we all need in this desperate time?
Secretary of State.
I can absolutely confirm that, and just for clarity, as was outlined in our guidance back in March, it is if a family has one key worker, they have access to those critical worker places.
I go to Asfal Khan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In light of exam cancellations, GCSE and A-level will now be predicted by teachers. An upcoming report by the Equality Act Review has highlighted the concerns of students and parents over this, particularly those from BME backgrounds. Has the Secretary of State assessed how predicted grades will further worsen the attainment gap?
Secretary of State.
The Honourable Gentleman raises a vital important point, and this was something that we had taken into account in our work with Ofqual and the exam boards to make sure that people from black and ethnic minority communities aren't disadvantaged in that way.
Andrew Percy.
Children in the communities I used to teach in who have been most disadvantaged over these last few weeks. But it is also the case that to catch up, these children need access to qualified practitioners. So as well-meaning as a summer school programme might sound, it needs to be longer term. And can you assure me that it will be delivered, whatever programme it is, in the longer term will be delivered by qualified practitioners?
Secretary of State.
My honourable friend makes such a vital point here in terms of, one, it isn't something that should just be short-term. It's got to be about people who are qualified and understand the issues and making sure that what they're teaching them fits within their whole, everything that they're needing to learn as they move through the school and as they move towards their exams as well. And this has to be an evidence-based approach. And we're working with organisations, whether it's the Education Endowment Foundation and others, to ensure anything that we do is focus on the best interests of the child and making sure that they can close that gap.
Alan Brown.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In Scotland, shielding's now been extended to the end of July, but in England there's still not the same clarity. So there's a risk that vulnerable teaching staff might feel pressure to return to work before it's actually safe to do so. So therefore, what's the Government's plans to enable staff who are shielding to be able to continue to work remotely and deliver lessons in a safe environment?
Secretary of State.
Well, for those who are extremely vulnerable and aren't in a position to be able to return to work, we're asking them to provide the important work in terms of remote learning and supporting the school in what they're doing. And it seems as if it's probably not a dissimilar approach to what is happening in Scotland.
Jack Brereton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for his statement. I've spoken with many heads in my constituency over the last few weeks, and all of our schools across Stoke-on-Trent have been able to remain open throughout the pandemic. I've spoken to a number of them who've seen unexpected costs during this time, particularly gaps in their budget from lost income, and of course many will still have to pay exam fees despite no exams. So will my right honourable friend join me in thanking all of our teachers for the incredible work they've done, and please look at what can be done to try and plug some of those costs?
Secretary of State.
Well, I'd very much like to thank my honourable friend, join him in thanking all the teachers in Stoke-on-Trent, and it's been great to see the schools in Stoke-on-Trent not just staying open all the way through the pandemic for those children who are most vulnerable and those children of critical workers, but so many of them opening up last week and seeing so many children come back into them. My honourable friend raises the issue of unexpected costs as a result of coronavirus. Secondary schools and primary schools have the ability to bid into a fund in order to recover some of those costs that they have maybe experienced as a result of the pandemic.
Claudia Webb.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I've been shocked and alarmed to be supporting a school in my constituency whose children have endured physical and violent instances of racism on their walk home. This week we've seen renewed calls for our schools to teach the true brutal history of the British Empire and the legacy of imperialism and colonialism rooted in racism which continue today to have generational impact. Given the ongoing systemic and structural inequalities and state-sanctioned racism, will the government reassure my constituents, including the children who are victims of racist abuse, by introducing a curriculum which educates all children and young people about the enduring history of racism?
Secretary of State.
I think we would all expect, and we all see, respect and tolerance to be at the very much the heart of what happens in every one of our schools in every part of the country. And that tolerance and respect for all, whatever your background, is so incredibly important towards education. Now, the national curriculum already has the ability to make sure that people are able to teach about whether it is what happened in terms of the British Empire, or whether it is not just through history, but through English and through PHSE. And there's an amazing range of resources, and we encourage all schools to look at those resources to make sure that children have the type of education that is able to reflect truly the rich and diverse nation of this truly wonderful country.
Ben Bradley.
Madam Deputy Speaker, recognising that it won't be possible to bring back whole school cohorts in primary schools until September, can you confirm that he will support and be flexible with those schools who would wish to bring back more than just the minimum number of children, where they're able to do that if they have the space and the staff to do that? Will he help them? And secondly, could I ask him to just lay out for the parents of those children who now won't be going back till September exactly what their childcare options currently are to enable them to get back to work?
Secretary of State.
Well, what we're doing is we're working to devise a priority list so that schools are able to, where they do have extra capacity, to be able to welcome back more children into those schools so that they're able to support their learning, but also their communities and including their parents, who, of course, do need to be going out to work as well.
Justin Matters.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. A full physical return seems some way off and may well be subject to further interruptions. So, given we know that there are still hundreds of thousands of children who are not able to access education remotely, will the Secretary of State redouble his efforts to spread out as far as possible that electronic means of education, give a date by which he can guarantee every child will be able to access their education electronically?
Secretary of State.
Well, we aim to get all the computers that we have purchased out by the end of June, and we're on course to be able to do that. And we do also recognise the importance of supporting children, not just through online learning, but additional learning that we can sort of provide them through schools, and making sure that we've also supported schools to be able to have Microsoft Teams and Google platforms in order to help them deliver more of a learning online, but also the physical learning that they can deliver by sending resources to pupils directly as well.
I go to Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Attending school supports not only children's education, but also their well-being, and that returning to normal routine will be immensely beneficial. Will my right honourable friend therefore also look at reintroducing the vital schools fruit and vegetable scheme as soon as possible for schools such as Lee Chapel Primary to ensure that the most vulnerable children get access to fresh and nutritious food?
Secretary of State.
My honourable friend makes the important point of getting children back into routine is vitally important, and getting as many children back into the classroom is all of our top priorities. In terms of a fruit and vegetable scheme, this is a scheme that's led by the Department for Health, but I will be in contact with Department for Health to have discussions, and I will get back to my honourable friend on the matter.
Steve McCabe.
Nurseries and early years centres in my constituency tell me they're facing losses of up to £50,000 this term alone. If the government doesn't act soon, there won't be many nurseries left to send our children to. When does the Secretary of State hope to come forward with a realistic plan to protect essential nurseries and early years provision?
State.
Well, within the nursery and early years provision, we've had an unprecedented package in terms of supporting them, whether that's for continued commitment in terms of paying money through local authorities to support them, whether that is through the furlough scheme or whether that is through rates relief. We constantly talk with the sector about how we can do more to support them and how we can support them more in the long term to deliver our combined aims of delivering a rich environment for children to be able to learn from those early years, but also whether it is a charity sector or whether it's commercial sector, for them to continue to be able to succeed and create a stable environment for all children.
We go to Lawrence Robertson, who I gather is audio only.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. A number of schools have got quite a few pupils who are children of critical workers, or the children themselves are vulnerable. And as a result, it's making it difficult for those schools to accept other pupils. Is there anything the government can do to help those schools? Any advice they can give them? Because they are anxious to move on, but are having problems doing so.
State.
My honourable friend highlights an issue that a number of schools are facing, and we're looking at working with them to add extra flexibility so they can maybe look at using different facilities and different resources that may be available to them in order to be able to expand their provision within that school.
Ian Mearns.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I noted the Secretary of State's throwaway criticism of my honourable friend on the front bench regarding the National Education Union, and I find that a tad ironic when he didn't even consult the NEHT, the Head Teachers Professional Association, regarding the original June the 1st restart date. We all want to get our children back into school, but far too many parents currently still don't regard it as safe, and that is understandable and hardly surprising when, in my region, the North East, parts of the North East, the incidence of COVID-19 is 5 times greater than in parts of the South West. One-size-fits-all policy should never have been considered here. Will the Secretary of State properly consider that when moving forward?
Secretary of State.
Well, this is why I stated earlier we very much want to work with local authorities that do have concerns to make sure that they're in a position to be able to open all their schools. And where they face practical problems or where they have issues, how we can discuss that with them to ensure that all their schools are open. If we're in a position where we have to close schools, well, then we'll be doing that in conjunction with Public Health England. But it is vitally important that we get all schools open for these year groups, but always recognising the fact that there may be clusters of schools that we do have to face closing for short periods of time.
Just a reminder that I would like to get everybody in, but that means short questions and short answers. David Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. When the Children's Commissioner appeared before the Education Committee last week, she said if no further children go back to school before September, 8 million children will have missed 6 months of learning. Given what we know already happens over the summer holidays, does my right honourable friend agree with me that's too long, and any school that conceivably can open should do so?
State.
I want to see all schools open, and this is why we're going to continue to work with all schools to continue to look at how they can accept more and more pupils into those schools, making sure that all children have the amazing opportunity of learning from their teachers. And I'm very optimistic that we're able to see more children returning to school, the number of children attending school increasing week upon week.
Patrick Grady.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. He mentions colleges in his statement, but does he recognise the important role that universities are playing as well in providing additional support for young people, particularly disadvantaged young people, such as the summer school being run by the University of Glasgow, which incidentally has just been rated #1 by the Complete University Guide? What support is he making available to that sector, given the funding gap they're facing, in order to respond to the whole range of challenges that COVID is presenting to education?
Well, I would like to very much congratulate the University of Glasgow on that great success, and I know that the leadership that is provided there is truly outstanding. And we will continue to work with the university sector, not just to see how they can support us in our response to COVID, and you've seen brilliant work in terms of the testing and the development of vaccines, as well as supporting NHS workers who have had accommodation provided. And that's why we brought out the stabilisation package for universities just a few weeks ago. We continue to work with the sector as to how we can do more and how we can continue to support them.
Ian Hines.
My right honourable friend is acutely conscious of the detriment to this extended period away from school, educationally, socially and indeed for mental and physical health. So can we have maximum flexibility for those schools that could welcome back more children with, for example, rotas, with use of suitable additional premises, or even having year sixes doing extended transition time in their soon-to-be secondary school, if and where schools locally believe they can?
My right honourable friend is absolutely correct. We want to give schools with maximum flexibility to get as many children through the doors before the summer holidays, and so that we can maximise their learning opportunities as a result of going back to school.
2930 withdrawn, so we go to Clive Betts.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. At the end of May, the respected Director of Public Health in Sheffield, Greg Fell, wrote to all Sheffield schools and strongly advised against opening because, amongst other issues, he had concerns about the availability of PPE, and also he wasn't convinced about the effectiveness of the test, track and trace system which was then in place. Does the Secretary agree that schools, as they have done on this occasion, should follow the advice of their Directors of Public Health, locally based, and not seek to second-guess that advice and think they know better about public health issues?
Secretary of State.
Well, we would encourage all schools to be returning and opening their doors to pupils, as I think we all recognise that the benefits that children gain, both physically, mentally, as well as in their learning, are so vast by children being able to return. And we would encourage Sheffield City Council very much to engage with us to ensure that they're opening, supporting schools to open their doors and get children learning once again.
Andrew Saloon.
Children at Wombourne High School in the Secretary of State's own constituency are very fortunate because they continue to enjoy virtual lessons. What will the Secretary of State do to make sure that all children can have that as well?
Secretary of State.
Well, my honourable friend absolutely is right to highlight the brilliant work of Wombourne High School in terms of supporting pupils in my constituency of South Staffordshire, and we want to see that being replicated across all schools. This is why we'll be setting minimum expectations in terms of curriculum delivery for the remaining weeks of this term, and also working with schools to make sure the bar is set as high as possible for those children who aren't able to come back to school, maybe because they're shielding in terms of minimum expectations of what we expect them to be learning at all times.
We now go to Marion Fellows.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Many people in the BAME community living in multi-generational households are not planning to send their children to school because they're afraid of them bringing the virus home to their grandparents. How is the Secretary of State going to persuade parents from disadvantaged backgrounds and from the Black and minority ethnic community to send their children to school?
Secretary of State.
Well, of course, the best advert as to why your children should be going back to school is when we see those incredibly powerful images of children returning to school for the first time. The absolute joy you see across their faces, their passion for learning, the fact that they're so pleased to see their teachers and their friends once more, and what they actually come back from school having had the opportunity to learn. That, for me, is the very best advert for what we're doing. But the Honourable Lady highlights an important issue of black and ethnic minority communities, and we continue to work with Public Health England and SAGE to make sure we do everything we can do to assuage their concerns in all communities, and that the best place for children is back in school.
Sarah Dines.
Thank you. I know my right honourable friend has tried very hard to get as many children back into school as possible, particularly the vulnerable ones. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that education supports not only social and well-being factors, but it's immensely important for those in non-accessible areas like rural communities like Derbyshire Dales to get them back to school as soon as possible when it's safe?
Secretary of State.
My honourable friend hits the nail on the head about how we need to get every child back to school. We shouldn't sort of stint in our ambition to see all children back in school, having the opportunity to learn at the earliest possible opportunity. I do not want to see this return to school delayed, and that is why, picking up on the points made by my right honourable friend, the member for Hampshire East, about the importance of looking at different ways that we can bring more children back so they have the opportunity to learn and be set new tasks and sort of new learning goals by their teachers before the summer.
Zeichner.
For sixth form and further education colleges in areas like mine, many young people get to college by bus. Indeed, Mark Robertson, the principal of Cambridge Regional College, tells me over half his pupils are in that position. Given that only 1 in 4 places on buses are now viable, there's a huge extra cost, which is a major obstacle to return. So could the Secretary of State tell us what his department is doing to help?
Well, we continue to work with the Department for Transport, the Local Government Association and local authorities and MHCLG on this issue. We recognise the challenges of home-to-school transport, and we'll be looking at how we can support them in terms of bringing more children back, especially as we move into the September period.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. If we're going to bring early years settings back, does my right honourable friend recognise the financial pressure on some of them that are operating as charities, and would he like to set out what we're going to do for them?
State.
Well, this is why it was so vital that we immediately made it clear to those organisations that we'll be continuing to support them with the grant funding that we have for those children who access those settings, and those organisations receive money from government, but also on top of that the furlough scheme and the rates relief that we've been able to offer many of those organisations. But we continue to work with that sector to find long-term solutions to some of the challenges that they face.
Kate Osborne.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. More than 80,000 children and young people across the North East receive free school meal vouchers, and bearing in mind that those children entitled to these vouchers are most likely to be in poverty and that we are currently living through a pandemic, what are the Secretary of State's plans to ensure that no child goes hungry during the summer holidays and that no parent or carer will have to rely on food banks?
Secretary of State.
Well, we continue to work with the Department for Work and Pensions, MHCLG and DEFRA in terms of this, and I talked about the unprecedented £6.5 billion extra that the DWP was distributing. We also have a Food and Holiday Activities Fund that we are continuing, looking to continue to run for this summer coming.
Chris Graham.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State rightly, in the early phase of bringing pupils back to school, identified Year 6s as one of the groups that should be brought back because they're about to transition to a new school. There are, of course, children in Year 2 in areas with infant schools that are in the same position. Can he confirm that today's announcements he will allow, and indeed give guidance that he will allow, those schools to bring back some Year 2s if they can ahead of the transition this summer?
Secretary of State.
Well, we are looking at giving schools much more flexibility to bring the maximum amount of pupils into those schools, and where you have transition years that fall slightly differently in different areas, one of the conversations we'll be having with those schools is how we can prioritise those.
We're now going to Amy Callaghan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Scottish Government, of course, took the decision in May not to send pupils back to school until after summer, so it's welcome to see the UK Government join us in similar thinking. However, at the same time, the Scottish Government took practical steps to combat digital exclusion, ensuring that vulnerable families were equipped with laptops and digital services. Could he outline exactly what similar practical steps he has planned for over the summer, on top of the laptops he has already mentioned?
To state.
Well, I don't wish to disagree with the Honourable Lady, but I think that we have a much more ambitious plan than Scotland in terms of actually wanting to see schools open, and we've seen literally thousands and thousands of schools open right across the country, offering lessons and support to children face-to-face by teachers, teaching assistants and everyone else, and I think that is far better than anything that can actually be delivered digitally, because there is no substitute to a brilliant teacher in a classroom inspiring a child. But as I touched upon, we'll continue to develop what our digital platforms, the Oak National Academy has delivered over 10 million lessons over the last few weeks. It's an amazing success and we want to build on that.
Flick Drummond.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As my right honourable friend has just said behind me, children who are transitioning into new school must have extra support over the next few months so they can feel comfortable about entering their new school. But has my right honourable friend given any consideration to allowing Year 6 to spend this term in the new secondary school so they're fully prepared for September?
State.
Well, my honourable friend highlights an important benefit actually that can be given to children, having the opportunity to spend some vital time in a setting that will become their new school, and how we can help facilitate that, but also how we can relieve some of the pressures that maybe exist within the primary school system, so that those primary schools can look at bringing more children in. But this is one of the options as part of our increasingly flexible approach to get more children in school, more children benefiting from education, that we'll be taking.
Mrs Emily Buck.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Myself and members across this House wrote to the Secretary of State asking for an extension of free school meals over the summer holidays. Throughout this pandemic, already over 200,000 children have gone without meals. He knows full well that the holiday activities and food programme will only target 4% of the children eligible. Throughout this statement, the Secretary of State referred to a long-term plan. What's in it and where do hungry children fit into it?
Was as every stage, the interest and the care for children within education is at the heart of it. But our focus as a department has been how we can support schools in supporting their children. That's what you've seen over the last few weeks, and that's what we'll continue to do. And our holiday activities, resources that we're looking at rolling out will be an important step in terms of helping local authorities doing that.
Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Could the Secretary of State please give the House an update on the progress that's been made to open universities? Online lectures can be very useful, but they're no substitute for face-to-face lectures, and also lectures that require some amount of practical work.
My honourable friend highlights the importance of ensuring that universities are able to deliver lectures not just virtually but also the sort of practical steps, opening up research facilities within universities as well. This is what we're working with Universities UK to ensure that they're able to return to as normal as rapidly as possible, so students get the best, but also the wider community in the UK gets the best for all universities being open.
Ali.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Sadly, in Tower Hamlets, we've seen the 4th highest age-adjusted death rate in the country, and the government's own report shows that BAME communities are at greater risk, with Bangladeshis twice as likely to face death because of the coronavirus pandemic. And parents are caught between a dilemma of survival versus education, because they don't have confidence in what the government's done so far with school opening. Can I ask the Secretary of State to publish a risk assessment area by area so that there's transparency and parents can feel more confident that the government has actually got a proper plan and that there's action to provide free school meals in some of the poorest communities in our country?
State.
Well, as every stage, we will take the maximum cautious approach in terms of how we actually bring schools back. And every step, whether it is making sure that children are able to coming back to much smaller classrooms, class sizes, so that we reduce the risk of transmission, making sure that the contact between children is absolutely minimised. All these steps, while they're incredibly challenging for schools and while they reduce the ease of operating schools, have all been done to reduce the chances of transmission. SAGE always publishes all of its papers and sort of makes them public, and I imagine SAGE will continue to do so.
Aaron Bell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Would my right honourable friend acknowledge the international evidence that looking at the R rate, either locally or regionally, becomes less useful as case numbers fall, and perhaps we should be looking at the prevalence data from the ONS? And in that light, would he commit to working with the sector to get all children back to school in September and supporting them to make up for the lost time?
State.
My absolute ambition is to see all children back in September, but over the coming weeks to maximise the number of children who are able to benefit by going into schools. And my honourable friend raises the important point. It's not just the R rate, it's actually what we're doing in terms of track and trace. It's what we're doing in terms of, everything we can do to minimise transmission within schools, to make them a safe environment for people to work in and for people to learn in.
Ed Cooper.
The problem listening to the Education Secretary is it just doesn't convey any sense that the government has a grip or a proper plan for the future. Can I ask him specifically what support is he going to guarantee for the 16 and 18-year-olds who feel particularly let down, who've lost their final term when they might have been getting additional support to get apprenticeships, to get courses, to get a place for the future, and currently are getting nothing? When will the guarantee for them be in place?
State.
Well, in terms of that age group, it's vitally important to be able to support them, not just in terms of their choices as to whether they want to go on to university or maybe into further education college, or whether through apprenticeships. And we're doing a lot of work in terms of skills to make sure that we are able to support them in their next step of that journey, and also through the National Careers Service to ensure that they're getting the best advice and the best guidance so that they can make the choices that are right for them.
Jane Stevenson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm sure we're all concerned to hear about the attainment gap between richer and poorer students widening during time off school. What measures will my right honourable friend take to close this gap and reassure parents that this government wants every child from every background, regardless of COVID, to reach their full potential?
My honourable friend and neighbour is correct in terms of how we support them, and as I keep touching upon, this isn't something that we can, there is no magic, simple solution that we can put something in place for a short period of time. This has to be over a long period of time. How we support their learning, how we close that gap, and make sure children from whatever background that they come from have the maximum number of opportunities as they go through the school system, and especially as they face exams in the near future.
Lyndon.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Long before the coronavirus pandemic, SNP-led Glasgow City Council had an ambitious programme in place to tackle holiday hunger. So why is it that children in the Shetland area of my constituency can be fed during summer holidays, but people in the South Staffordshire constituency the Honourable Gentleman represents won't be under his plans?
State.
Well, as I've touched upon, not only through the Department for Work and Pensions, but MHCLG and DEFRA, we continue to look at how we can support those families who are most vulnerable and in most need of support.
Scott Benton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is undoubtedly the case that it is pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds who are losing out the most whilst schools remain closed. Over the last 10 years, we have made fantastic progress in closing the attainment gap between children from poorer backgrounds and their more affluent peers, which has greatly improved the life chances of children in Blackpool. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that we risk undermining this excellent progress if those schools who are able to reopen safely choose not to do so?
State.
The biggest impact that we can have on any child is making sure that schools are open and welcoming back the maximum number of pupils into their classroom to have the opportunity to be in front of their teacher and to learn from them. That is how we can help them more than anything else, any other intervention. But we do recognise we have to do more on top of that, and that is what we're going to do. But opening the doors to schools, making sure as many children are able to go in and to learn, that is how we will close that gap more than
Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. At Thursday Business Questions last week, the Leader of the House suggested I should direct my question to the Secretary of State then. The cap on the number of English students that universities in the devolved nations, including St Andrews University in my constituency, has been applied without consultation and will further financially impact on institutions that have already made placing offers as they deal with COVID-19. Will the Secretary of State commit to meeting with me, or at least engaging with the governments of the devolved nations and bodies such as Universities Scotland to mitigate this impact?
Secretary of State.
Well, the Honourable Lady will be pleased to hear that we continue to engage with the Scottish Government over this, and will continue to do so going forward. It was very much part of our stability package that we put there to help universities, and we hope that by working with the Scottish Government, Welsh and Northern Irish governments, that we'll do everything we can to support this vital sector.
William Brown.
Will my right honourable friend insist that Public Health England, local authorities and schools work together seamlessly when there is an outbreak of COVID among a member of staff?
It is absolutely vital that they work seamlessly and together if there is such an instance, because what we want to do is to protect the children and those who are working in schools to the maximum of our ability, and ensure that when it is safe to do so, that those schools can reopen as swiftly as possible.
Thank you.
Point of order, Madam Deputy.
Point of order, Dawn Butler.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, on the 4th of June, the Minister for Equalities misled the House when she made the statement in regards to the Public Health England report. The Minister said that the report was led by the black doctor, Professor Kevin Fenton. This was not in fact the case. The Minister also misled the House when she said that third-party submissions were not part of the report. I have written, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the Minister, but I wonder, is there a way that we can compel the Minister to return to the House to correct the record?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for that point of order. I'm sure she would mean that if the Minister misled the House, it would be inadvertently. So I would expect that the Treasury bench would report back the fact that the Minister's statements have been questioned, and if there has been any inadvertent misleading of the House, I'm sure the Minister would want to correct the record. Thank you. Now, in order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next, I'm suspending the House for 3 minutes. Get his Oh yes, of course. Order. Presentation of Bill Gavin Newlands.
Employment Dismissal and Re-employment Bill.
Second reading what day?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. Thank you. We now come to the 10-minute rule motion. Nikki Aiken.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to provide for the regulation of the carrying of passengers in Greater London by pedal cycles and power-assisted pedal cycles for hire or reward and for connected purposes. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm sure honourable members will be familiar with the sight of pedicabs or rickshaws on the streets of London. Pre-COVID-19, they might have come out of the theatre to a row of pedicabs ringing their bells, playing their music, touting for business, haggling over trips to stations, restaurants, bars or hotels. They may seem like a fun way to end an evening, a white-knuckle ride through the streets of London on your way home. But you may find there's a sting in the tail. You may be told, when you arrive at your destination, that the price you originally agreed to was for one person, and that as you were two, it is now doubled. I have heard of tourists being charged upwards of £100 for a mile journey. Surely, you wonder, pedicabs must be regulated. They must run a meter, be insured, have their vehicles regularly inspected for faults and roadworthiness. Shouldn't they have to undertake the same checks and balances of other vehicles for hire? Our traditional black cabs and private hires, such as Uber, are heavily regulated. Well, sadly, none of the above is true for pedicabs. Due to a loop in the Metropolitan Public Carriages Act of 1869, pedicab operators are not classified as stage carriages. As a result, there is no requirement for insurance, no requirement for fares to be fixed or consistent, and no requirement for vehicles or drivers to be quality assessed. They are the only form of public transport in London that is not regulated in any way. And estimates suggest that there are around 2,000 of them in operation in central London alone. Alongside the fact that because pedicabs are not insured or checked in any way, they are a risk to those that use them. They are proving to be a risk and disruption to Londoners at large. They often play loud music late into the night as they drive the streets. They can drive dangerously on the pavements, putting pedestrians at risk. Accidents are becoming more frequent and hit and runs are not uncommon. They have also been known to promote criminal behaviour. According to a 2015 Evening Standards report, pedicab drivers were being paid tips by prostitutes for taking passengers to brothels for sex, as well as reports of facilitating drug dealing across the city. Westminster City Council receives a large number of complaints regarding pedicabs. In 2016, the last year for which the council maintained figures in this area, approximately 1,000 council-led interventions against pedicabs were required. However, this is not to say that all pedicab drivers or operators behave in this way. We have seen a growth in pedicab provision on the basis of providing an environmentally friendly alternative to taxis and other forms of public transport. Some operators have taken it upon themselves to insure their vehicles and drivers, as well as regulate their fares. However, it remains the case that these good operators are under no obligation to take the steps that they have, and they remain in the minority. I would like to also take this opportunity to highlight the growing number of bona fide companies that we see using pedicabs to deliver goods around central London. Of course, they offer a more environmentally friendly delivery service, which should be welcomed. It is not about taking them off the roads. I would wish to encourage much more greener vehicles such as these on our streets, as long as they are roadworthy and the drivers have been checked. That is why I and a cross-party group of London MPs have brought this bill before the House today. It is essential that Transport for London is given the powers to regulate pedicabs, to make sure they're safe, that their fares are reasonable and consistent, and that rogue operators can no longer present a threat to residents and businesses in London. I also have cross-party support from outside this place. The bill is supported by the Mayor of London and Lambeth Council, as well as Westminster City Council and the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. It is also supported by London Councils, a cross-party organisation representing London boroughs. The bill is supported by the London Taxi Drivers Association, the New West End Company, Heart of London Business Alliance, as well as resident associations and amenity societies across Westminster, including the Soho Society, Marylebone Association, Marylebone Society and Covent Garden Community Association and the Knightsbridge Association. The bill allows TfL to set requirements around drivers' eligibility and conditions, thereby preventing the current exploitation of some drivers by gangmasters. We must recognise that there is a minority of pedicab drivers who may be at risk themselves of being trafficked and be part of a modern slavery abuse. Having the regulation as outlined in this bill could help stop that practice if drivers have to be checked. The bill protects the consumer by ensuring quality and roadworthiness of vehicles. The bill will offer some comfort to businesses and residents by allowing for conditions to prevent pedicabs standing or plying for hire in specific places or at specific times, as determined by Transport for London.